Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Christianly. This is your host, Brad Andrews. Hey, thanks again for joining us for this week's edition of the podcast. As we say each week, this podcast exists to cultivate holy courage in you. And we do that by looking at issues in our culture through a biblical lens so that you can grow in your confidence to stand firm on God's truth. So let's jump right into issue number one. What happens when a society insists that biology is negotiable but refuses to look at the consequences of that decision? And what do we do when real-world data contradicts what we were told to simply accept?
I think it's very significant. Finland, which of course is not a Bible Belt country, they studied more than 2,000 young people, adolescents and young adults, with gender confusion that had sought what they call gender reassignment. That could be puberty blockers, that could be surgery. And supposedly when you get these interventions, if you will, you're supposed to end up with better mental health. But what they found, and I'll read it from the study itself rather than summarize it. It says, quote, "Considerable increases in need for psychiatric treatment were seen among those adolescents who had undergone medical gender reassignment." And it went on to say, regardless of gender, adolescents suffering from gender dysphoria present with excessive psychiatric morbidity. Subsequent to medical gender reassignment, psychiatric treatment needs appear to increase. In other words, the young people who received these interventions got worse.
I've seen this uncomfortable question asked before, but it is a profound one. If genitals don't define gender, how does removing them affirm it? Last week, a landmark peer-reviewed national study came out of Finland that, as you just heard in that clip, from my perspective, answers that question correctly. And this study was not some cherry-picked small sample size study. This was a study that tracked, listen to this, every gender-referred adolescent in the country of Finland over the span of 25 years from 1996 to 2019. And the data that was drawn for that study was from mandatory health registers that Finland themselves required doctors to submit. The study was led by Rita Kiertu-Kaltiala, a professor at Tampere University Hospital, who just so happens to be the same clinician who runs Finland's youth gender clinic. She also advised another study in the UK that followed over 2,000 gender-referred individuals and matched those against over 16,000 controls. But for the sake of our story today out of Finland, here is the bottom line that came out of the study. Psychiatric outcomes did not improve after gender reassignment. In fact, they surged. For example, morbidity rose. For those that underwent feminizing procedures, psychiatric morbidity rose over 50 percentage points among young women. Masculinizing procedures showed a similar pattern, with psychiatric morbidity rising 33 percentage points. And before you say, well, they were probably already struggling, the authors of the study actually accounted for that as well, even after adjusting for prior psychiatric history. Gender-referred adolescents faced ongoing psychiatric risk roughly 5 times higher than the male controls and 3 times higher than female controls. Again, in short, medical transitions appeared to be linked to a deterioration in mental health. So let me just translate that for you. The proposed solutions given were not solutions. Now, we've said this before on the podcast, but it bears repeating. When institutions and media and medical professionals align around what I call untethered empathy rather than the truth, things like compassion get redefined as care. And at that point, you don't have a conversation anymore with those institutions. You have a closed system. But there is another group that is culpable in all of this as well. In her book, Irreversible Damage, Abigail Schreier flagged some of the early signals of this same phenomenon. Clusters of adolescents, often in very stable and affluent homes, adopting gender transition narratives. And more specifically, Schreier observed that certain parenting styles contributed to this. For example, if the parent gave endless permission and affirmation to their child and very little resistance to those that were struggling with gender dysphoria, saying be whoever you want would win out. But Finland's data refuses to cooperate with any of these institutions. Here we have, in the study from Finland, a national, long-term, population-wide data set saying what many are not allowed to say out loud, and that is that the interventions being presented as solutions are not resolving the distress that young people have. They are actually intensifying it. This should really be a moment of epistemic humility for us. But the question is, will it? Because typically what happens in these moments is often looking the other way or maybe just waiting out the news cycle in the hopes that this will get memory hold. But the burden for us as Christians here is real because behind every policy debate are actual people. People, and in the Finnish study, children who are confused. And they are hurting and they're searching for answers, searching for meaning. So there is no room for mockery here, but rather true compassion that is tethered to the truth, and maybe even with tears in our eyes. But friends, clarity must remain clarity. If a proposed path consistently increases psychological distress rather than resolving it, then at some point we must be allowed to ask, or maybe I could say demand, that things change. See, Christians too often outsource our moral reasoning to these institutions that have already declared certain conclusions untouchable. We do not begin with consensus or groupthink. Our starting point is not what feels right or seems to be best. We begin with creation, Genesis 1. Not affirmation. We begin with truth. So when a study like this surfaces, it should not be dismissed or buried. It should be weighed, because the goal is not to win an argument here. The goal is to tell the truth about what a human being is and what true suffering is, but also what actually heals. We are not the saviors of anyone's story. We are witnesses to the one who redeems what is broken. And if anything will heal what is fractured, it will not be affirmation without truth. It will not be truth without love, but it will be Christ himself, held out clearly and without apology, because Christ is the one who can heal. We are called to be faithful witnesses, steady and honest, and yes, compassionate, pointing broken people to a whole Savior. And now for our deep dive issue number 2. What do you get when a culture insists that biology is negotiable, but language must be tightly controlled? And what do you do when the law begins to enforce that reversal?
We are here today in the wake of the horrific Supreme Court decision early this morning. We need to be very, very clear that conversion therapy is psychological torture. It is not possible to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity.
The modern West seems to have a real talent for denying reality while adopting illusion. You just heard in that clip from California State Senator Scott Wiener that he believes that it's not possible for someone to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. What is the illusion I speak of? Well, it's this, that one's sexual identity is something that you can invent rather than something that you receive. It really is an ancient lie dressed in modern language. Your feelings are the authority. Your biology is open for interpretation. And anyone who questions that is not just wrong, but dangerous. But every so often, reality punches back, and that punch was what Wiener was responding to in the clip that you just heard earlier. But let's go back to trace how a case made its way to the Supreme Court on this issue. Back in 2019, the state of Colorado passed what was called its minor conversion therapy law. This law told licensed counselors what they could and could not say to minors regarding things like gender identity and their sexuality. Back in 2022, Kaylee Childs, who herself as an evangelical Christian counselor, sued Colorado with regards to this law on the grounds that it kept her from working with young people who desired to live in line with their faith. And in her words, she wanted to help reduce or eliminate unwanted sexual attractions, but was unable to do so because of this law. And what she argued was that this law was banning what she called talk therapy, and that violated her First Amendment rights. What is talk therapy? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a form of counseling where help and guidance and care can happen through conversation. It's just words aimed at helping a person understand their thoughts and process their emotions, and Lord willing, pursue meaningful change. Well, the case was first heard in a federal district court in Colorado, which actually upheld the Colorado law. Childs then appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and that court also sided with Colorado. This is when the Alliance Defending Freedom group came into the picture. ADF is a prominent Christian legal advocacy group that's focused on protecting things like religious liberty and free speech, which is what Childs was dealing with. But they also do things around the sanctity of life and the family. They were founded way back in 1994 by a group of evangelical leaders who saw the cultural and legal landscape shifting away from a neutral direction. And they knew that Christians were going to need help in the legal system. So in this particular case, Childs, backed by ADF, petitioned the U.S. Supreme Court to hear their case, and the court agreed. And on March 31st of last month, the Supreme Court actually ruled 8-1 in the case of Childs versus Salazar. And what's important to note that in its decision, the court didn't strike down the law outright, but it did something strategic. It said that the lower courts used the wrong legal standard. So rather than giving the state broad leeway on how this law must be interpreted moving forward, they said that the law must now be evaluated under what is known as strict scrutiny, which is the highest formal level of constitutional review. See, the Supreme Court uses that language to signal that they see this law in Colorado as potentially infringing on core constitutional freedoms, especially free speech. Childs won this case. But the translation is this: if the state wants to tell a counselor, you may say this, but not that, it better have an extraordinarily good reason to do so. And it better prove there is no less restrictive way to achieve that, which is a very high bar. So what is the significance then of this decision? Well, there are a couple things. First, it's notable that 2 liberal judges on the Supreme Court voted in favor of this strict scrutiny, Justices Kagan and Sotomayor. The lone dissent came from Justice Brown Jackson. This is telling. Even justices who usually vote in favor of progressive outcomes drew a line here. In other words, this wasn't a typical left-right split. It really seems to be a moment where the weight of the First Amendment pressed hard enough that even some on the court's left flank stepped back and said, this is really going too far. And so I think that shows us this: when a law is so one-sided that it permits only one approved narrative, it stops being a law in any meaningful sense. Really becomes enforced orthodoxy. Even 2 liberal Supreme Court justices saw that. But more importantly, this decision rebuked the idea that this was more than just a bad policy. It was a chastisement of what I would call epistemological tyranny. Here's what that means. A law that says you may not tell a confused boy that he is in fact a boy is not regulating therapy. It's legislating untruth. The phrase conversion therapy is a rhetorical cudgel that's used to justify all of this. It conjures images of very barbaric practices, but to conflate these extreme practices, like Wiener did earlier, with conversations between a counselor and a client, it's just straight up deceitful. By defining any effort to reduce same-sex attraction or resolve gender dysphoria as conversion therapy, Activists like Wiener create a moral panic that conveniently excludes their own practices from, yes, scrutiny. If a child is encouraged to transition, that is not conversion in their world, that is affirmation. But in ours, if a child is counseled to accept his body as it is, as they should, it's deemed as not being care, and that is somehow then harm. The irony is rich. The same movement that insists gender is fluid suddenly becomes rigid when a child wants to move in the opposite direction. You may transition from male to female, they would say, but they will not let someone move from confusion to clarity. You may convert the body, but not the mind. You may change everything except the narrative. That is why Colorado was eager to play chaplain to this new religion and wrote it into law. Now, here's where Christians must pay attention. This is not merely a legal skirmish on a national level. It is a theological collision that is playing itself out all over this country, even in Red, Oklahoma, where I live. See, at its core, Christians must determine something. They must figure out what they believe about anthropology. And that is so that they can navigate this issue with wisdom and courage. Anthropology answers the question, what is man? Scripture answers this question with precision. Male and female, he created them. In other words, the body is a gift. It is something that is given. And there are two sexes alone, male and female, no more, no less. That is why a law like the one in Colorado targets speech. See, the serpent's first move in Eden was one of persuasion away from the reality we just spoke of. Did God really say? And modern progressivism follows the same script, only now it adds legal penalties for answering the question correctly. And in doing so, they insist those falsehoods be affirmed, even celebrated. But here is the truth of the matter. They may try to criminalize speech, but they cannot rewrite creation. They might try to pressure the conscience, but they cannot unmake what God has made, which means that this ultimately isn't a battle about therapy or even the law. It really is a battle about truth versus fantasy, creature versus creator. So let's be careful here. There is a temptation to spike the football on something like this decision, to treat this as a final victory. But that would be premature. Remember, the law itself still stands, but with just stricter interpretational guidelines. But for now, the court has said, the Supreme Court, the state cannot force us to lie. And so the deeper question is whether we will choose to tell the truth anyway. Because in the end, the question in Eden still remains, did God really say? And now issue number 3. We live in a world that will talk endlessly about everything that doesn't matter, but grows strangely silent when it finally does. So what should we make of a man who speaks the name of Jesus while orbiting the moon, and what does it reveal about us?
Apollo 8 had a memorable Christmas Eve reading from Genesis. Do you have a message you'd like to share from space about Easter Sunday?
You know, I don't have anything prepared. I'm glad you brought that up, though. I think these observances are important, and as we are so far from Earth and looking back at, the beauty of creation, I think for me, one of the really important personal perspectives that I have up here is I can really see Earth as one thing. And, when I read the Bible and I look at all of the amazing things that were done for us who were created, it's you have this amazing place, this spaceship. You guys are talking to us because we're in a spaceship really far from Earth, but you're on a spaceship called Earth that was created to give us a place to live in the universe, in the cosmos. I think maybe the distance we are from you makes you think what we're doing is special, but we're the same distance from you, and I'm trying to tell you, just trust me, you are special. In all of this emptiness, this is a whole bunch of nothing, this thing we call the universe. You have this oasis, this beautiful place that we get to exist together. I think as we go into Easter Sunday, thinking about, all the cultures all around the world, whether you celebrate it or not, whether you believe in God or not, this is an opportunity for us to remember where we are, who we are, and that we are the same thing, and that we got to get through this together.
Now to something that is both, I think, encouraging, but also convicting. On April the 1st, NASA sent 4 astronauts into deep space aboard Artemis 2, what would be the most powerful rocket system that we have ever built in our history. Over 8.8 million pounds of thrust hurled these astronauts beyond low Earth orbit for the first time in more than 50 years for a 10-day mission that would ultimately circle the moon. The Artemis 2 crew included Americans Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch, as well as Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen. Wiseman served as the mission's commander, and Glover served as its pilot. And while the crew members did not land on the moon for this trip, their mission was to lay the groundwork for a possible moon landing by the year 2028, with also, yes, plans for a human colony on the moon soon thereafter. Now, what made this trip to the moon significant was twofold. First, the last time that NASA sent humans to the moon was December 1972 during the Apollo 17 mission, over 5 decades ago. That's a pretty big deal. But second, this trip to the moon would push the crew 250,000 miles past the furthest point that any human has ever traveled. The previous record was set by Apollo 13 back in 1970. Now, what I took note of in this mission to the moon was someone in particular, American astronaut Victor Glover. Why did Glover capture my attention? Well, he did not treat this moment as an astronaut as merely scientific. He actually treated it as theological and maybe more importantly, doxological. Now, Glover is no lightweight. He had been a test pilot. He had flown in combat missions. He had logged thousands of flight hours in his career. And in short, he was a man that has been forged in discipline and endurance. And yet, in the clip that you just heard, when asked what his message would be for the people of Earth on Easter Sunday, he spoke of Jesus. He spoke of Jesus' love. And that happened right before the spacecraft passed behind the moon. In other words, as he was staring at the vastness of creation, he did not default to vague spirituality or scientific jargon. He quoted Jesus. He unapologetically said that the greatest commandment is to love God and to love your neighbor. And Glover didn't stop there. After arriving safely back home just this past Saturday, he thanked God during his news conference in Houston. He struggled to describe his gratitude for everything that he saw, but what he did say is that he was so thankful to God for the strength for the trip. He also thanked his family, he thanked NASA leadership, and most of all, the Lord. And in a viral video I just saw today that surfaced showed him on the driveway of his Houston home exhorting his literal neighbors to truly be neighbors with one another. He repeated his message from space and said, hey, God told us to love him, so let's do that. We're neighbors together. Let's love one another well. I bring up these examples to really talk about how uncommon this is. We live in a cultural moment where Christians will speak freely about everything except ultimate things. But the name of Jesus, spoken without embarrassment or without qualification in the public square, that is actually unusual. I believe that is in part because we have been discipled into being hesitant about our faith. We've learned to measure every word for risk. We edit ourselves before anyone else can. We anticipate objections we've not even been asked. And so when given the opportunity, instead of boasting of Christ, we manage perception, and we call it evangelism. This is where the conviction of this story comes in for me. What Glover has done in this moment is expose just how thin our excuses really are. Like, here is a man with global visibility, and he still found a way to speak plainly of Christ, not once, not twice, but I think I counted 3 times there, and to do it without apology. I found a quote actually from Glover from a podcast where he said, there are no atheists in foxholes. There aren't any on top of rockets either. And the irony of that quote is that when we choose to stay silent or hedge when given the opportunity to speak of Christ, we are actually acting as functional atheists. And here's what I mean by that. We can celebrate sending men to the moon, but struggle to tell those closest to us who made that moon. We can map the far side of the lunar surface, but hesitate to speak of the one who hung it in place. And Glover is reversing that trend. It should challenge us. It challenges me. Glover did his job so well. He served his team. He fulfilled the mission, but he did not check his faith at the launch pad either. That is a model for us to look at. Not every Christian's going to stand on a rocket, but every Christian stands somewhere. And when it comes time to speak, the issue is never the altitude, it is allegiance. Hey, thanks again for joining us. If you would take a second to respond on whatever platform you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, be sure to like the video, subscribe, hit that subscribe button so that you don't miss future episodes. On Apple Podcasts, you can follow the show and leave a 5-star review there. Those reviews really help us more than you know. On Spotify, tap follow and turn on notifications so new episodes land in your feed there. We're also on social media. Be sure to share this episode and jump into the conversation there. On Instagram, follow us at ChristianlyPod. Turn on the notifications there. Tag us in your stories. On Facebook, you can find us at Christianly and give us a follow there. On X, you can follow us at Christianly_pod. Make sure and repost the episode there. Drop your thoughts and we'll be in touch. Hey, if you're in the Tulsa area or you're just passing through, I'd love to meet you in person. You can join us at the church that I have the privilege to be the lead pastor at, called Cross and Crown, at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday mornings for worship here. We meet at Will Rogers Church at 11th and Yale in the urban core of Tulsa. And remember, don't just listen to the podcast, speak and lead. Share the light. And remember that there isn't a corner of this world that doesn't belong to the King.